Welcome to the New America Foundation. My name is David Gray, and I direct the Workforce and Family Program as well as direct our Religious Center initiative. And it's my pleasure to welcome you and our speakers to this discussion on September 11th of Gustav Niebuhr's new book, Beyond Tolerance, A Search for Interfaith Understanding in America. One of the most recent initiatives we've been focused on at New America is to look at how people are crossing barriers to strengthen America's social fabric. And Diana Butler-Bass and I, having coffee maybe a year ago, were talking about, what is being done outside of larger areas that we know about where people are crossing barriers and doing work that is crossing faith barriers to strengthen America's social fabric. And lo and behold, Gustav has written a tremendous book on exactly what Diana and I had just been talking about. And so we're honored that both Gustav and Diana have taken the time to be with us today. Thank you for coming. I'll also point out that this event is being webcast across the web. We know as there are remembrances today on September 11th at this exact hour that we thought we'd webcast this for folks who were unable to be here live. So this will be live webcast as well as taped and on our website later today if others want to see it. I'll also point out, as with you, I extend my thoughts, my prayers this morning and in remembrance for September 11th and for those who lost so much and for the remembrance that this day holds in our nation's fabric. I'll be walking this Sunday, some of you maybe as well, in the 9/11 Unity Walk as we recognize not only a date that has remembrance of loss, but also of our common humanity, and that many of us know that we have as much in common with those who hurt us as different. And so that the common bond that unites us is something that I take personally and that many of us I think take personally. So that 9/11 Unity Walk is something that will be interesting. But when we talk about interfaith work, I was so pleased that Gustav put this work together because it gets at some of what many of us are quite interested in, that the social fabric of America remains frayed 7 years after September 11th, and that what we hear in the media is largely some of the challenges that faith and belief bring, and that how that factor and force often divides people. And one of the great things around Gustav's travels and work are the power of religion to unite people, and that the common work across different faith boundaries is something that can actually and is currently being done in a variety of positive ways. And so that's going to be our topic today. Gustav's going to talk for a bit about his journey and about his book, and then I've asked Diana to respond. And then I see some folks here who I'm sure have a perspective that's going to be valuable for us to hear, so we'll try to allow as much time for dialogue and question and answer as possible. While it's being webcast live, we don't yet have the ability, although we're trying to allow the web folks to ask questions, but we hope to get there for one of these events in the future. So without further ado, Gustav Niebuhr, and by the way, his book is available outside for those who have not seen it yet. He's a professor at Syracuse University. He's an accomplished writer, written for a variety of print publications, and is a frequent commentator on NPR and other places. And Diana Butler-Bass is known to many of you for her work as a scholar and speaker. Christianity for the Rest of Us is a book that I know many of us have learned from, and I know she's just finished another book which many of us will benefit from reading when it comes out next spring. So I'm pleased to welcome Gustav Niebuhr to the podium to discuss his experience and his new book.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I feel as if I'm switching media right now. Now I get to look people in the eye. I was just on the radio, and there's always something a little bit challenging for someone who's come out of a print journalism background. I spent 20 years in newspapers, and that is, when you hear the sort of the disembodied voices of callers in come across the air. I see some people nodding. It's so one imagines what they must look like, and the expressions on their faces. Well, any case, I'd like to tell you a bit about how this book came about, Beyond Tolerance, Searching for Interfaith Understanding in America. I spent, as I say, 20 years as a newspaper reporter, the bulk of that time covering the very quiet and obscure subject of religion in the United States. And it was, fortunately, I had good imaginative editors, so I was able to convince them that it was, in fact, a national story, that it deserved looking at it in as wide a perspective as possible. Now, this will surprise you. I spent a good bit of time writing about religious conflict, particularly within religious groups. I mean, I know that comes as a shock, does it not? I began with the Southern Baptists when I started in Atlanta. But one of the things that became increasingly apparent to me, particularly in the late 90s, was that there was what I considered to be a major story out there that was floating beneath the radar, going uncovered, and that was the fact that people were using religion to come together and to cross boundaries, to build groups, and to network. And that would become even more significant in the wake of 9/11, whose anniversary we mark today. What was happening, as I discerned it then, was there was a response going on to two things. One was the obvious pluralism that was becoming increasingly visible in the American religious landscape since reform of the immigration laws starting in 1965. There were a good many people coming to the United States who really had not been represented here in great numbers before. Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Jains, Sikhs, others. And the building of those communities, of course, is something that Diana Eck at Harvard has explored in her own book, A New Religious America. But what I also found was that, partly driven by curiosity and also partly driven by response to religious violence in the world, starting with perhaps the war in Bosnia, was that people were seeking ways to talk to each other, meaningful ways to talk to each other, that did not overlook religious differences, but sought to dismantle stereotypes and also to find a common ethical ground, which would begin with conversation and could eventually lead to joint endeavors, working for the social good in one way or another. And as I say, there was a certain amount of this work that got going in the mid to late 90s, but it really took off after 9/11. It achieved a real sense of urgency. And there were many people whom I spoke with who said, you know, if there is something that we can claim out of 9/11 as having been a positive, then this is it. The feeling that people are impelled to get to know each other, to break those stereotypes, to essentially drive this counter movement in the world away from the worst part of religious exclusivism toward greater understanding and cooperation. Now, how many of these groups are working? Where are they? Well, there's not much actually on the national scene outside of national organizations that are specific to a religious tradition that have made statements endorsing this kind of activity because their members participate in it. Most importantly, of course, the Roman Catholic Church in a declaration dating back to the Second Vatican Council. Also, the National Council of Churches and other denominations, Christian and Jewish, as well as statements from Islamic groups, Buddhist groups too, in the United States. But largely this is a decentralized grassroots movement. It happens at the local level, and it's often, I guess for lack of a better term, the result of the sort of the entrepreneurial instincts of someone or some people at the local level. Somebody deciding this is what we need to do. Let's see how we do it. Case in point, which I deal with in the book, is the Long Island rabbi, and this actually predates 9/11, who said to one of his leading lay people in the congregation, can we find a mosque where they might want to meet with us and we just have conversations, get to know one another? And she, after several phone calls, was able to find one nearby, also on Long Island, where, yes, in fact, people were quite interested in meeting American Jews and getting to know them on a personal basis. And what resulted was 15 years, going on 15 years of dialogue, conversations, meeting in people's living rooms, starting out with sort of easy stuff, so to speak, talking about differences, in how, or similarities in how one approaches life cycle events, births, weddings, funerals, things like that, moving on to a discussion of scripture and religious practices. And then, as the rabbi said to me, it got really interesting. They decided to talk about the Middle East and didn't agree. But by then knew each other well enough that they could argue. And he took great pride in the fact that this had been going on for 15 years, as did the president of the mosque, whom I interviewed, and who said, look, in the wide scheme of things, it may just be a blip in the, in the world, but it certainly has enhanced my perspectives on the Jewish community. I suspect it has for them on the Muslim community here in the United States, and I can hope that the world will be, in that sense, somewhat better for our children. I think that's what people aspire to in one way or another. One of the things that I think is very important, though, now about this is even though it occurs at the grassroots, it does, in fact, constitute a decentralized movement. And for that reason, it is worth paying attention to, particularly at a time when the United States, I think, is not well known abroad anymore, or not very well appreciated abroad. What's happening here, I think, has the capacity as a citizens' grassroots movement to affect at best, to affect the way that we are perceived abroad. Because if we have groups in this country that are willing to engage in substantive dialogue with each other, taking differences into full account, and extending that basic respect, not only is civil society being built here, but that attitude is, I think, transferred abroad. I mean, we don't live in a bubble. People do hear about what we do here, and people who get involved in these groups, particularly among recent immigrants, have friends and family overseas. Word does travel. And so I see this as the interfaith movement as a movement that is built around a basic ideal of peacemaking and shoring up civil society. I also think it has the capacity to enhance the reputation of Americans abroad at best. Now, why do I hope for that? I'm thinking of something very specific now. Those of you may have seen an article by Michael Slackman, who's a reporter for the New York Times, on the 9th, 2 days ago. It was datelined Cairo, and it was sort of a roundup of his conversations in the Muslim Arab world, and how people on the street simply couldn't believe that bin Laden and his gang were capable of slamming those planes into the World Trade Center in the Pentagon. And they thought that even if Muslims, Arab Muslims, had been involved in this, they just didn't have the capacity to pull something like this off. And that, in fact, it had to have been the U.S. government that was involved in it. And the reason was because the U.S. wanted an excuse to invade Iraq. So, I mean, just terrible, terrible, conspiracy theories being offered straight up like that. Well, the thing about Slackman's article that I think was very interesting was that part of this stems from the fact that in many of those countries, people trust neither government nor media at all. Their government, they believe their governments are unrepresentative. I'm saying nothing new here, and regularly lie to them. And they believe that the media is state-controlled. And so they tend to discount this stuff. I mean, this has been written about. And that's why I think that the work that goes on here that has a citizen component that does come up from the grassroots is of another dimension. And that's why I am hopeful about it, and hopeful about its capacity to have some influence abroad. Circles can be built, they can be widened. But here in the United States, this too, and this is something that I deal with in my first chapter, was really the untold story of 9/11. I was in the New York Times newsroom on that day, and the story that we expected to tell, and which existed out there, was the story of the backlash. That is, the rage that would be provoked against people who either were Arab or Muslim or were perceived to be that way, which actually spreads over a large section of the population if you stop to think about what people can imagine. There were some of those acts, and they were truly terrible. There were a handful of people who actually lost their lives in the backlash. Fortunately, no more than a handful, but still, every life is precious, certainly what I believe, and I'm sure we all do. And there were buildings that were vandalized. What we missed, I think the community of journalists missed, simply because the people involved were not putting out press releases, simply because they were not dealing with the police, was that there was a great deal of response from non-Muslim Americans reaching out to the Muslim American community in a protective way. And I encountered that in Seattle and in Denver and in Virginia and also in New Jersey, just to name a few places. It also went on in a very low-key way in other places too. People either standing guard around mosques or Islamic schools or Sikh gurdwaras, because if you remember at that time, there were a good many people who thought that because bin Laden wore a turban, then anybody wearing a turban was must be a friend of bin Laden's. A terrible, terrible mistake, which caused the burning of a Sikh gurdwara not far from where I live in Syracuse. That's another story that I tell in this. But as I say, we missed the good side. We missed this public activity, this building of networks, of links, some of which have endured as interfaith groups. This coming together of Americans. This, if we're in a war of ideas, this is the other idea. This is the other idea. This is the idea that's directly against terrorism and religious extremism. This is the idea that there is something vitally important to preserve in civil society, and not just that, to go further than simply preserving it, but to be able to meet and talk to people in a way that educates yourself about them, and to find, despite differences, the ethical ground, the social ground on which we stand together. Let me give you just a very a brief reading from a couple of passages here, just to give you an illustration of some of the examples that I mean. One is directly after 9/11. I assume, do I have time for that? Sure. Okay. About the time the hijackers flew the first of 2 commercial jets into the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001, the Reverend Frank Hubbard was setting up folding chairs in his church's front room in South Brunswick, New Jersey. Hubbard, who described himself as an evangelical, held a weekly Bible study each Tuesday at St. Barnabas Episcopal Church. A few minutes after 9 a.m., one of his parishioners rushed in distraught. Tearfully, she told him she'd heard on the radio that a passenger jet had slammed into the Trade Center. As he listened to her, Hubbard felt an initial incredulity, swiftly replaced with a rising sense of outrage. Some radio shock jock, he suspected, had decided to perpetrate an extraordinarily tasteless hoax on innocent listeners. Well, after all, years earlier, the area had been the subject of a similar broadcast scare. St. Barnabas sits a few miles north of Grover's Mill, the hamlet that Orson Welles identified in 1938 as the landing place of invaders from Mars. Welles's broadcast set off a panic New Jerseyans took to the roads in flight. As Hubbard hurried out to his car to listen to the news, he began to hope that the story was only that, a hoax. Moments later, of course, he learned otherwise. When the priest returned to the church, he found the phone ringing. The local school superintendent told him to come to an emergency meeting of community leaders. The terrorist attack would be felt locally. South Brunswick lies an hour from Manhattan, making it highly likely that some of its commuting residents worked in the center's towers. But before he rang off, the superintendent asked Hubbard whom else he should call. Phone the 2 local Roman Catholic priests, Hubbard replied, and, he added, the head of the local mosque, Hamid Shebli, the Lebanese-born imam who served as a spiritual leader at the Islamic Society of Central Jersey. Hubbard then drove to the school board offices where city officials were gathering. On the way, he began to fear that the Islamic Society, a green and white building with a distinctive dome and a large identifying sign, might pose an inviting target for someone some idiot, he would say, to vent his rage. So when Hubbard spotted South Brunswick's police chief, he rushed over and said, "You need to get cruisers down to the mosque." When the chief replied that he had already sent police to protect the building, Hubbard let out his breath, and he offered a silent prayer. "Thank you, Lord, for this community." His prayer, brief though it was, encapsulated a vital and important truth that in the United States, community can extend beyond religious boundaries, incorporating people whose fundamental views of the universe are sharply different from one another. If not the prayer itself, then that idea of community was on the minds of an untold number of Americans that same day, and many of them acted decisively to preserve it. As they did so, they acted to keep alive the civil society that is necessary to our most basic freedoms. I had no idea that such work was going on that day. I'd like to read just a couple more passages, one of which will come back to Hubbard, and then I look forward to Diana's response. Bear with me, I have here, I think, a copy of a book that I didn't mark up, so I should remember what I wrote, but there's something here that just causes me to skip ahead. Or actually, it may be back. The way I begin this book is by talking about how there are any number of books about religious violence, and this really deals with that problem only tangentially because it deals with the alternative to it, the other wave. But I do quote a passage from a very good book called Terror in the Mind of God by Mark Juergensmeyer, who's a sociologist at UC Santa Barbara. And what he writes in the book is a sentence that I think really, really stands out. "It is difficult to belittle and kill a person whom one knows and for whom one has no personal antipathy." The key phrases are whom one knows and no personal antipathy, 6 words that point toward a markedly different type of interaction among people in a world in which violence seems so dominant. What interests me in writing this book is the idea that some people choose to build networks deliberately across boundaries in an era in which religious differences are so explosive. Call it a quiet counter-trend. It directly challenges violence in God's name, even if it does not replace it. At its heart, it's a grassroots educational process in which the goal is to gain knowledge about individuals and their beliefs in a way that lessens fear. And fear is something, of course, that has pervaded this decade. I listened to, before I went on the Diane Rehm show this morning, they had a group of people who were talking about nuclear terrorism. I swear every second sentence was fear. Fear. I was just about trembling by the end of that show. So I was glad to have something else to talk about. This is a new activity in the world, an entirely new phenomenon in our history, that is the interfaith movement. It is a social good, a basis for hope, and a tendency that ought to be nurtured and cultivated. Now, what about Hubbard? Let me go back to him. I first met Hubbard after I saw a notice announcing a memorial service for the World Trade Center's dead a year after the attacks. It was to be held at the Islamic Society of Central Jersey. The mosque he'd feared might be vandalized on September 11th. That evening, the imam, Hamed Shebli, spoke, saying that 2 Muslims who regularly attended Friday prayers there had been among the Trade Center workers who perished that day. Others spoke too: the mayor, a couple of city councilors, the police chief, as well as several Christian clergy, a rabbi, and a Hindu priest. I counted 150 people present, the folding chairs spread wall to wall in the prayer room. It was the full neighborhood in its civic and religious dimensions. Over lunch several days later, I asked Hubbard why he thought it important that morning a year before, when many people felt overwhelmed by the singular horror of the terrorist attacks, to worry about the welfare of local Muslims. He responded that he had 2 thoughts in mind. He feared that the terrorist attacks might simply be a beginning, albeit an extraordinary one, and that destruction could ripple outward, shredding the country's social fabric. A line had to be drawn, he said, explaining that if vandals vented their rage against the mosque with spray paint, rocks, or guns, that meant, quote, a further spiral of violence that's going to make the situation more difficult, close quote. In that sense, reaching out across faith lines meant trying to stabilize the situation on behalf of a common good, whose loss could be exceptionally dangerous. But he also had another reason. He had gotten to know Shebly and to appreciate him as a thoughtful and hospitable man. Quote, there was a face on the mosque, Hubbard said. There was my friend Hamad. It wasn't just this foreign building that you pass on Route 1. The fact that it's personal makes a difference, close quote. He had gotten to know the imam the day he and some other ministers stopped by the mosque to pay a courtesy call on Shebly, whom Hubbard had not met. Unexpectedly, they arrived at an intimate moment in the Islamic Center's life, with the imam engaged in preparations for a funeral. But rather than excusing himself, he invited his visitors to stay and observe how he, as a Muslim, dealt with this rite of passage. Quote, at first I was rather startled, Hubbard said. I thought, well, that's very gracious. What do we do? He ended up shedding his shoes, taking a seat in the back of the prayer room and watching. He decided that the imam's invitation was part of his educational outreach to us, non-Muslims, who were his local colleagues. Shebly had indeed been gracious. He had told the family of the dead man that the other clergy present were his friends. Later, Shebly told me that he intended the invitation to help lay a common foundation. His visitors, who themselves conducted funerals, would get to see him do the same. Religious people would observe a religious rite. I don't consider it a sadness issue, he said. Let us be familiar with each other. Well, that sort of familiarity was still a relatively new concept for Shebly. He had briefly served in New Orleans before coming to New Jersey. But prior to that, his experience was of Lebanon, a nation riven by a civil war in the 1970s in which religious divisions between Christians and Muslims, as well as between Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims, were amply apparent. There, he had taken no part in interreligious ventures. He'd never set foot inside a Christian church, nor had he ever seen clergy of different faiths share a platform. But in New Jersey, he had been invited by the Catholic Archdiocese of New York to take part in discussions between Roman Catholics and Muslims, a process he remembered fondly. Along the way, he had met the late Cardinal John O'Connor, and at one point, camera in hand, had asked permission to photograph the cardinal as he stood between two other imams, one a Sunni, the other a Shiite, representing the two major branches of Islam, whose relations have often been very tense, as in present-day Iraq. To Shebly, that particular moment felt like a watershed. The Catholics had passed on an idea, and Shebly, a newcomer from the Middle East, had picked it up. After 9/11, the imam received an invitation to speak in Princeton Theological Seminary's chapel, the first Muslim to be so honored. That day, he presented a copy of the Quran to the seminary's president. He had concluded that such interactions were a blessing on America. Quote, I consider it good in the eyes of God what we have achieved in this society, close quote. He was describing himself as a participant in the process. As if on cue, while he and I sat talking in his Spartan office, his fax machine began to hum and click. We paused for a moment as it dispensed a letter from a Bible college an hour or so away, thanking Shebly for agreeing to host 24 students from a world religions class that coming Saturday. The imam turned back to me. All of us are in the same boat, he said. We pay the same tax, we share the same sewers, we use the same water, breathe the same air. Well, that's one way of putting it. But it seemed to me that something larger is at work here, something more than a willingness simply to live and let live that makes for peaceful coexistence. As I left the mosque, knowing that the Bible college students would be there shortly, I realized it imminently possible that some would want to meet a Muslim simply to figure out how to proselytize one eventually. That would certainly be their right in a nation that embraces religious liberty. But it might equally be true that meeting Shebly, a single believing Muslim, might introduce some of them to the world into which they would graduate, in which they would live with billions of people who sincerely held beliefs different from their own. And then I quote here briefly a statement from the National Council of Churches, a much longer statement, which is in the book. There's a huge paper trail out there endorsing interfaith relations. Today, the spectrum of religious tradition and practice in the United States is wider and more complex than ever before. Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, Hinduism, Sikhism, Native American traditions, Baha'i, and other faiths are now part of the American landscape, close quote. The Council's statement also identified a way for Christians to discern a common denominator among these groups. As it says in Genesis' first chapter, everyone is made in God's image. Quote, when we meet a human being, no matter what her or his religion, we are meeting a unique creation of the living God, close quote. In one way or another, that realization was acted out by people in various places in the United States in the immediate wake of 9/11. One can read a theological meaning into it, or one can simply identify its civic value. Those constructive acts demonstrated a belief in a common society that incorporates differences, that values life by valuing individual lives. It's a belief that utterly rejects the means and goals of fearmongers, especially the terrorists who attacked the United States. It is also a more subtle and inspiring, and one hopes more durable, approach to the world than one that sets up a contested realm of us versus them. So thank you. I think that's where I'll pause. And Diana?
Good afternoon. Oh, some of you are church people. When I read Gustav's book, I put it down and said thank you to him from my study. And I did so for two reasons. The title, Beyond Tolerance, pushes us to think about American society not just as being a tolerant society where we accept sort of a bland difference among one another, live and let live, but actually pushes us beyond that to think about what real engagement and real relationship would look like between people of different faiths. That beyond, the beyond tolerance, made me think of two other beyonds that are implied in his book that are also very important things for us to deal with, I think, in the context of the discussion he has framed for us today. The first one is what I call beyond notice. And this is the idea that many writers, journalists, bloggers, even people who write sustained books and scholars are so busy right now kind of keeping up with the cycle of what they think is new and immediate that they are tending to write stories about what is only obvious and not what is beyond immediate notice. I think that this is, for our culture, a problem, and that there is need to pay sustained attention to movements and people who are off the radar screens of our instant word culture. In my own work from 2002 to 2006, the same time which Gustav was writing this book, I was writing a book on what was going on with mainline Protestant churches. People who knew I was writing this project would say things to me like, oh, you're writing about mainline Protestants? How long is that taking you? 3 weeks? There was all kinds of stereotypes that I was writing about a dying tradition, a tradition in decline, a tradition that was thin gruel theologically, a tradition that didn't have much to say about what was going on in the United States today. And as I was going around the country doing 4 years of solid research in this project, I kept running into a very strange phenomenon. I was in an Episcopal cathedral in Portland, Oregon, where they had just wrapped up a series that had lasted some 6 months called the Abrahamic Initiative, where Protestant ministers from Portland, Jewish rabbis, and Muslim scholars and imams had gathered together over the course of this long period of time to discuss their theology, their ethics, and their spirituality. The person who told me about this was a priest in this Episcopal cathedral. And she said, I'm not sure we changed America by doing this. But what we did do is that the Christians learned how difficult it is to truly host a conversation in which we aren't in charge. And her thoughts have stayed with me since that comment. She told me that about 4 years ago. There were other congregations in my study that were doing similar things. There was a Abrahamic Bible study that was sponsored by a congregation in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a UCC congregation. And I kept seeing these little projects in the vital mainline congregations that I was studying, projects where people were reaching out across boundaries to make friends with their neighbors, and every single person I interviewed said that the work they were doing was a direct result of what had happened on September 11th, 2001. This work took me not only to Protestant congregations, but eventually other religious leaders began hearing about the research I was doing and wondered how it would apply in their own settings. In one of the stranger moments of my life, I received a telephone call from a group of rabbis from Westchester County who called me and asked this Episcopal female theologian to come and lead their retreat. So I said yes, thinking that this would be a very interesting experience. I got on Amtrak and went up to New York City, really not having any idea of what awaited me, except that these rabbis were looking forward to me sharing the content of my research with them in a context of Jewish worship. We had a fabulous 2 days, which amounted to me at the end saying to one of the rabbis, "I want to be a Jew." And he then turned to me and asked, he said, "Well, do you follow that rabbi Jesus?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, do a good job with that, and it's close enough." And I was sitting at lunch when this conversation unfolded, and another one of the rabbis turned to me. He's a rabbi of a very successful synagogue in a large Midwestern city. I could tell he wasn't born in the United States. He had an accent that I couldn't immediately pin down, and he eventually did tell me that he had been born in Jerusalem. He had been in the United States for some 30 or so years. He started telling me about his synagogue, which of course was my task. I was there kind of as a consultant about vital congregations. And he said that recently his synagogue had grown so large that they had to sell the property and build a new synagogue. And this was really very hard on his congregation because the congregation was located in an urban area, which gave the synagogue its most immediate ministry, and that is it served the homeless in this Midwestern city. The only property they could afford was not another piece of urban property. It was too expensive in their city, but they could only afford a piece of property out in the suburbs. And so this left this Jewish congregation a little heartbroken. How were they going to demonstrate God's shalom for the world in the suburbs? It just didn't make any sense to them. Well, one day the rabbi, as he unfolded this story, he said, "I was having lunch with a friend. The imam from the local mosque." Now, that caught my attention immediately. He told me that the imam had been born in Syria and had likewise come to the United States. And the rabbi then reported to me that part of the reason he wanted to come to America was that he could befriend Muslims and Christians in a way that he could not back in his own homeland in Israel. And so when this imam had arrived from Syria, the rabbi was one of the first people to greet him. Well, he shared this dilemma about the Jews moving to the suburbs with the imam, and the imam said, "You know what? We're having the same problem at our mosque. We've grown too big for our building, and we're beginning to look for a new piece of property." The rabbi said the two men looked up from their lunch and stared at one another's eyes, realizing that they could indeed build a mosque and a synagogue together. They have embarked on this joint project in their city to put these two buildings on the same piece of property, and in doing so called up the local Roman Catholic Archdiocese to ask and see if they could put a church on the same property. After much conversation, the Catholics turned them down, but I understand that the Anglicans have now entered into the conversation. But the rabbi said to me at the end of this long, wonderful story, he said, "This, to me, is America, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians can meet on the same land and worship the God of Abraham. I had no idea what to do with that story until I read this book. And why I think about it so much, this idea of going beyond notice, is that if indeed there are these kinds of stories randomly happening across the American landscape, and we have no cohesive sort of narrative in which to tie them all together, then they just remain anecdotes, exception to some sort of religious rule of inevitable conflict. But what Gustav has done is he has noticed, and he has put together, this is one of my friends as a sociologist says this, when you put together enough anecdotes, they become data. He has put together enough anecdotes that they have become data. And I think it's data that well proves that there is some sort of different movement afoot in the land, and one that we all could learn from and by paying attention to it. The second beyond, and I'll go to this very quickly, came from a throwaway line in the very first part of the book. It was in the introduction. This beyond is that he has suggested a way for religion reporters, religious leaders, even maybe political leaders, to get beyond the language of left and right. In the very beginning of this book, he says, in what I said is a throwaway line, that he's not going to write about these violent, extreme forms of religion. And then he says, these are militant forms of religion. And in parentheses, he says, notice I say not conservative, but militant. And then through this entire book, he makes a deft distinction between religions that are in favor of violence and extremism and exclusivism, and religions that are embracing and creative and generative. Some of the people that he talks about who are generating, who are birthing the possibility for this interreligious dialogue are actually theologically quite conservative, and others are theologically liberal. And so this whole panorama that he presents, this whole narrative that he unpacks in front of us, implies that there is a different kind of distinction among religious groups in our nation, one that doesn't fall along liberal and conservative lines, but rather these lines of militancy and what I would call generative faith. And I found that to be provocative and helpful, because again, this is something that I saw in my study, that liberal conservative didn't seem to fit at all when I was describing mainline churches, and I had no real language to talk about it. In conclusion, what I read and what he has talked about today, and just these couple other things that I like to sort of enrich his amazing book with, these other two beyonds, lead me back to Diana Eck, a book that he quotes somewhat frequently in this. Diana Eck, who teaches at Harvard, about 15 or so years ago, suggested that the United States was a diverse society, but not yet a pluralistic one. And that is, we were able to live with a lot of people who were different from one another, but that we hadn't created what she called the positive kind of society that is a fully pluralistic society, where people actually know one another, they relate to one another, they work together, and they are creating different pathways through religious difference that go beyond tolerance. She hoped that she would see this in her own lifetime. That's very obvious in her work. And what I think that Gustav has done for us is that he has traced the emergence or this shift from mere diversity to a beginning or incipient kind of American pluralism. And that will have, as he indicates, great political, social, and cultural consequences. And as an American, a person trained in American religious history, I would like to suggest that the fourth great awakening that so many people have been talking about for the last 10 or so years is not an awakening just of evangelical churches or churches like Saddleback Community Church and Rick Warren out in Southern California, but that the fourth great awakening may be just this alternative story, this counter movement to what is obvious and in front of our faces, and that it is an awakening that is moving a surprising number of people at the grassroots and calling for deep transformation in our religious communities and our political life. So thank you, Gustav.
Just terrific. I want to thank Gustav and Diana very, very much. And now let's engage in a time of question and answer. I'm going to take prerogative and ask them each a question to start off with, and then Christina has a microphone, and because we're, again, broadcasting this live, I'll encourage you to when you ask your question, to use the mic. Let me just follow up on some of the comments of some of the exciting work that's being done that crosses boundaries, to ask Gustav a bit about where he thinks, looking forward, society or institutions should be placing their investments in this area. And what I mean by that is we think about, maybe we probably represent a variety of contexts in this room. Maybe some folks are serve churches, and maybe you're academics, maybe you're just interested. But I'm curious to see. We've got this feeling that the interfaith movement, the work being done, needs a spotlight shown on it, and there'll be people who will learn and who may emulate that. I think just getting the ideas out there for best practices to be shared is incredibly important. But I'm curious to see where maybe the most effective social fabric building work is being done that you say this is some piece that ought to really be replicated, that there ought to be a broader role for public policy or for foundations or for others in this area, or that maybe the most fruitful work as we think about the world is we're concerned about, maybe this is the Diane and Reem question, if there's another terrorist attack, habeas corpus goes out the window, and there needs to be real work in sort of this particular area of intra-faith dialogue as opposed to interfaith dialogue that crosses the liberal-conservative boundary so that people of their own faith can be, frankly, successful talking to less pluralistic folks of their own faith tradition to strengthen the fabric in a way that people can't intra-faith talk to folks, but only folks of the same religion can talk to more fundamentalist folks in their own tradition to prevent some stronger reaction down the line. So I'm interested in where the most fruitful national or even local work could be done, if there's a few things that are just the most critical in strengthening the social fabric through the work that you've observed. I'd be curious to see if there's any reaction to that.
Well, let's see. In some ways, the beauty of this is that it is so decentralized and so grassroots and so open in that way to the individual imagination. Although, of course, we discern a common thread in terms of the basic intent and path. There is room for foundations, of course, to look into funding actual organizations that grow out of this, and that has happened in some cases. The most notable one we spoke about earlier before we came in here, and that's the Interfaith Youth Corps in Chicago, run by an Indian-born Muslim, Ibu Patel. And what he has done, he's, from my perspective, a young man, he's about 30. He has gone to college campuses across the country and brought together people involved in various chaplaincies and gotten students to talk to each other about what they think is right socially and to express that from their religious traditions without in any way sort of overlooking differences. And together they've gone out then on these projects, rehabilitating houses and other valuable civic assets. That has drawn some foundation money, but I think what needs most to be done right now is to find a way that some of these groups can communicate with each other and communicate with a broader public. It's not the news media that's going to do it, and thank Diana very much for, calling attention to that line in the book. Actually, it was one that I thought about a lot because I always felt kind of handcuffed as a journalist, caught in this stupid paradigm of liberal conservative, which I just don't think really describes our world. It doesn't. What is a liberal? What is a conservative? I'm not sure I can really define that, and certainly not in terms of religion. So somehow these groups need to speak more to each other, and there needs to be the space. Fortunately, we have the technology of the internet now, in which ideas can be traded and too expressed outside of national boundaries. As getting back to what I said earlier, I think they need to be exported as well to the best of one's ability. What inevitably anything that is shared and is picked up will be transformed, and transformed according to the local situation, and that's all to the good. So I think that's as much as I can see right now. I don't really see a role for government in this. I don't. It just, this is something that has grown up in the, our ideal model of church-state separation and is flourishing there as religion was meant to in this country and as it should be.
Just to make a plug for one thing, before we go on, we've got this Religious Center blog here, and my intern on that last summer discovered that there is a whole group of universities now that is starting to take a look at interfaith, and Niebuhr's work has certainly helped spur that. One thing we're working on now is trying to start a series of interfaith journals on college campuses that there haven't, even at Florida State and others where there's a real emphasis from the university on it. There's not really preparing future clerics in different faith traditions to sort of dialogue with each other. So Stanford has started this journal called Encounter last November, was their first one, and our intern actually got someone may be here from the Berkeley Center at Georgetown actually, but Face to Face will be Georgetown University's Interfaith College Journal, and then American University, where I'm also a chaplain, is now at the administrative level interested in this. So it's interesting to see some of the university levels looking to start journals that work across faith lines. Diana, let me just ask you to apply some of the work that you've done in your area of church and congregation revitalization to the interfaith area. And I'm just, as I talk to other pastors, people are concerned about, they love the idea of interfaith work, but when their priority is trying to keep the lights on and to build their congregations and to provide pastoral care, and they're torn in so many directions, people don't think that they have just, on the priority list, it doesn't get high enough. But for examples when they have to move to an area that the city they don't want to move in, there's a financial motivation for it. And I just wanted to be curious. I'd be curious to see if your experience in terms of interfaith work as a way to help revitalize a congregation, or that there is some role by coming in contact with other faiths in terms of dialogue, strengthening the religious basis of one's own faith. And so I'd be curious to apply your experience in broader congregational renewal to the interfaith area.
One of the things that I was most grateful for when I read Beyond Tolerance was that he has an entire chapter on the practice of hospitality. And I think that is the most natural congregational practice that relates to interfaith work. I kind of worry a little bit about all of a sudden every congregation in America coming up with a program for interfaith cooperation or something. It smacks to me a little bit like what you're saying. It's the government sponsored. If the denominations all of a sudden get their minds around this and think this would be a really good idea for everybody to do, I also agree that the beauty of it has been the grassroots. But what I really love is the idea of seeing interfaith work through the prism of spiritual practices. And he unpacks hospitality very well as a practice that is foundational to Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, which is something that I've written about too. So I didn't know if he had read what I wrote or if it's just all a big coincidence.
Great minds.
I actually think it was a coincidence the way that it was structured.
I would have cited you if I read that.
So I think that the practice of hospitality, that is welcoming the stranger, is acute. There's an acute need for that everywhere we are in terms of ministry. I was talking to a Methodist pastor in Nebraska about 8 months ago, and he said, well, I like all your stuff on congregational renewal, but I just don't know what it much has to do with life here in Nebraska. And I said, he said, we're just a traditional place, and things don't change in Nebraska, et cetera, et cetera. And so I asked him, I said, is there a mosque that you can drive to from the small town in which you live? Silence on the other end of the phone. He knew he'd been caught. And I said, yeah, I thought so. And then I said, is it just poor white people and poor black people who are picking your vegetables and your farms in Nebraska? And again, silence. And he said, no, most of the people come from Latin and South America. And so we got to talking about this practice of hospitality, how that's just a basic spiritual call to all congregations, whether they're struggling with money or not. And the second practice, very briefly, I think, is the practice of forgiveness. One of the most amazing, I thought it was one of the most amazing stories that came out of the whole research project I did was from a Lutheran congregation in Yorktown, Virginia, that sits on the very edge of an Air Force base down there. And it was probably the most conservative theological congregation that I was in for my project. On September 12th, 2001, that congregation held a prayer service in their church, much like many congregations did across America. But there, with these relatively conservative Lutherans and this military community, their prayer service started out, Lord, we ask you to help us to forgive those who have done this. The forgiveness were the first words out of the mouths of these military officers and these conservative Lutherans. There was not a word about vengeance anywhere in that congregation. And that set up for this church an entire way of dealing with all of the political and social issues that were to come, including issues of reaching out to their neighbors. And they never once looked to a Muslim with hatred from that church. And so I think those hospitality and forgiveness are a place for everybody to kind of start.
Great. Thank you, Diane. All righty, questions. We'll start here at the gentleman. You might identify yourself and as the microphone comes around.
Student at Cornell, I was very involved with Cornell United Religious Works and the Center for Religion, Ethics, and Social Policy, which was in an interfaith center at Cornell. And I've since continued to be involved with that in this community. I'm a Christian and I attend a Christian church. And I also go to regular Baha'i firesides, which I didn't know anything about at that time. I'm getting to a question.
Yeah.
When I reach out to people in the traditional evangelical Christian community and ask them to read the Word of Christ with me, the Sermon on the Mount, there is massive resistance in that community towards actually reading and discussing the main message of Christ, which was given at the Sermon on the Mount. And I personally, as a progressive Christian, think that it's critically important that we get the evangelical community to start focusing on what Christ actually said and what the message was about. And I have found more resistance to that than I would have ever expected.
Interesting. Comment from either?
I think you really have. That's very important. Your outreach there is important in and of itself. I look on the evangelical community as being tremendously diverse and becoming more self-consciously diverse. And I'm not just speaking in terms of ethnicity or race or such, but I think in terms of viewpoints and in how it relates to the larger society. I think one thing is prominence and size, and it has grown certainly in the last couple of decades, have propelled some to think in terms of their responsibility to society and to their neighbors in ways that perhaps weren't quite envisioned before. There is activity within part of the evangelical community toward interfaith dialogue. There are books that are being published on it now. They lay down, of course, certain guidelines that I don't find particularly problematic about, just being careful we maintain differences, but at the same time looking for the common humanity and trying to understand. However, there is a real need for what you're talking about too, the intra-faith dialogue. And I'm sort of surprised that someone would turn down the opportunity to talk about Jesus. I mean, that, if you put it that way, look, I want to talk with you about Jesus. Okay, great. That should be the response. But then, okay, what I want to do is I really want to talk about the Sermon on the Mount. Can we sit down together with our Bibles and study them together? And I think if you persist in this and cast the net wide enough, you will find people who take you up on it. It's going to be uncomfortable for them, maybe uncomfortable for you, but that's good, because then that's real dialogue, and I'm hopeful about that. One of the ways that, and I'll mention a name familiar to everybody in Washington, Jim Wallace, I think really approached the hard political, some of the hard political people in the so-called Christian right, the evangelical right, was in the late 90s. He said, look, we're all Christians here. Let's talk about Jesus. Let's talk about what Jesus says. And it disarmed people in a way because they were used to dealing with liberals, quote unquote. They didn't really want to talk about Jesus very much, whether they were Christians or not. It was private. But this created ground for communication.
Okay. So.
Michael Marshall, UPI. I'd like to ask a question, given my professional background, about major news media and the coverage of religion, which I think, Mr. Niebuhr, with your background, you're hopefully well positioned to answer. I mean, it's my impression that not that long ago, maybe 20 years or less, religion didn't make a news story unless there was either conflict or scandal. That has changed gradually with news organizations, more of them taking on dedicated religion reporters, and the scope of what is religious news expanding. I mean, nevertheless, you still have a situation where the story you told about Reverend Hubbard, in terms of national media, makes the tiniest blip, whereas Franklin Graham's comments about Islam are broadcast at pretty high volume. What's your take on where major media is at in its coverage of religion, and where would you like to see it move, that it could move within its institutional constraints?
Oh, it's one could write a book on this.
Yeah.
Well, I started reporting on religion in 1986 at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, of which I have very fond memories. And I found even then that there was a greater interest. I think there were two things that did it. One was, and they both happened in 1979, one was the formation of Moral Majority, Inc., and the other was the Iranian Revolution, neither of which editors had any way been trained to sort of deal with and couldn't imagine. I mean, they had sort of, I think newsrooms bought the secularization theory of the 1960s, lock, stock, and barrel, thought religion was either going away or going to become totally privatized. But after those world-changing events, the election of Ronald Reagan with a very important core of overtly religious or evangelical supporters, and also the Iranian Revolution, two very distinct events, I think that there was an expansion of the religion beat at the better media, and it's one that's continued to this day, although with ups and downs, particularly in the newspaper world, which is not doing very well economically. Mm-hmm. But I also think that the coverage has grown more sophisticated in some places, and it's not just, I think what you were referring to earlier is the old adage, if it bleeds, it leads. I think that in religion, we've gotten beyond that, and I think part of that, too, was in the wake of 9/11, news organizations responded with one of the very positive things was a real attempt to educate the public, particularly about Islam. And so there were any number of stories just about Muslim people, Islamic practices. there's never enough good religion writing from my point of view, or reporting. There's just never enough. I mean, it's a fundamental part of American society. It's just not covered the way that other things are. And part of the problem is, and I don't mean to be long-winded, there's just no score at the end of the day. You know, what media covers best, traditional media, are politics, business, and sports, because there's always a number at the end of the day.
Very interesting. Sure. Sir.
Al Milliken, American Independent Writers. I was curious if how you think presidential and I suppose even vice presidential leadership may affect potential initiatives or, you know, the work that you would like to see happen. I mean, just, you know, my initial reaction is Barack Obama with his exposure to Islam, you know, in a way that very few Americans have been in his early life, and then, you know, his work as a community organizer in particular, you know, and working in from a mainline Protestant denomination. He would be some, you know, as ideal a person as anyone may be, you know, from your point of views. But then I'm wondering how you would react to, you know, John McCain, he left the Anglican Church. My understanding he's Baptist now, and what's that? Yeah. So is he still he's still officially Episcopalian? Okay. And Sarah Palin, my understanding, she's Assembly of God. Although I guess she attends many mainly non-denominational churches, is my understanding. But I remember when John Ashcroft, you know, was being seriously considered for Attorney General, there was a lot of media reports about his Assembly of God Pentecostal religion, and, you know, mostly there was, you know, curiosity and strangeness to, you know, it seemed like, at least from, you know, a media writing viewpoint.
I've thought that it was interesting that the four candidates come from such different places religiously. You have Biden, who's very traditional Roman Catholic. You have Obama, who is really classically mainline Protestant with the African American reading running through his mainline theology. You have McCain, it strikes me as being rather secular. I mean, he may have grown up as an Episcopalian. I'm an Episcopalian, so I can say these things. He reminds me of a lot of Episcopalians of an older generation who couldn't say a word, really, about their faith. I mean, they might have had it, but it was deeply privatized, and they couldn't explain it in any way, shape, or form, publicly or theologically. And then you have Palin, who is a very extreme form of evangelicalism, which I have in the last 10 days had a number of evangelical theologians confess to me that they're afraid of. So there's this incredible diversity among these four people who are all, you know, striving for the highest office in the land, and how they would approach the role of religion vis-a-vis these very difficult international and domestic issues that we're facing, I think is reflected in the theological traditions of all of them. I think with Biden and Obama, you could trust a kind of a generalized common good sort of approach with a broad toleration for a variety of religions coming to a table and trying to create new solutions. And I think with McCain and Palin, you would have probably a continued influence of the religious right on the issues that matter to the religious right. And I think you would probably have from McCain maybe a bit more of a banishment of religious issues from concerns that he feels religion shouldn't be involved in. So I think that their approach might actually be more divided than the other side of things. That would just be my intuition.
I think that's, you know, that pretty much responds there. The only thing I'd add is one thing that's very interesting is that 3 of the 4 have clearly been on religious pilgrimages of one form or another. Obama coming from, you know, being raised without a faith and then, you know, converting to mainline Protestantism. score one for mainline Protestantism there.
Go figure.
And go figure. I mean, yeah. And then, McCain, a cradle Episcopalian who was an altar boy, actually, in his Episcopal parish and served, as he says, as an informal chaplain.
He went to Episcopal High School, right?
Yeah, he went to Episcopal High School. He served as an informal chaplain when he was imprisoned in Vietnam, and now is attending his wife Cindy's Baptist church. And then Sarah Palin, who was baptized a Roman Catholic and has just been all over the non-denominational map. And you just have Joe Biden as sort of the pillar of stability in all this.
Trust the Catholic Church.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. But I think that in itself represents something that goes on in America increasingly. That there are people who make changes. Changes within Protestantism are not necessarily so remarkable, but that you should have it concentrated in this sort of leadership cadre right now is very interesting.
It's interesting to see that Obama spoke a very detailed faith-based plan last July, yet the Democratic platform has more about what religion is not: no proselytizing, no separation no violation of the First Amendment, no discrimination. A lot of questioning in the platform itself around the role of religion policy, despite a very detailed faith-based piece. And then I think a more secular McCain has been much less reluctant to wade into what role a faith-based institution at least would play in his administration, particularly compared to his predecessor. But I think that to me at least, gets at some of the big issues. A more secular President McCain, a more comfortable Obama talking about it with the skepticism still is a strong strain in the Democratic Party to the role of faith in public life, at least in the way policy is formulated. Coming out of their individual faith, I think that probably continues. Yes?
I have a couple of things to say. My name is Karin Rosnitzek. I'm actually from Munich, Germany. I used to work at the U.S. consulate, and we did a lot of kind of interfaith things. We started out doing interfaith things such as, Muslim outreach was the new word, and so, we got together with imams and did iftar dinners and so on. So that was basically something on the diplomatic channels. Here I've been, and that is right up your alley, what you have been saying. I am a volunteer for the 9/11 Unity Walk, and that is basically really a grassroots open interfaith event taking place this Sunday. And, we work together with the Interfaith Youth Corps and Ibu Patel and people like that. What I wanted to say is, for me as a European, I'm a very secularized European, and whenever I hear that, my first impulse when I hear religion being used so much in the rhetoric here, I always have a very allergic impulse because it can be so manipulated and so misused, especially in the presidential elections. And here with that interfaith kind of work, what amazes me is, first of all, it's very inclusive also in terms of including people with no faith. You can come and walk with us down on Embassy Row as an atheist. They are still existent in the world. And second, the fact that we want to do some youth education, because a lot of people, especially youth, they do simply not know about other religions, and how could they, and how could I? We want to do a youth service initiative to expand that moment, that experiential moment of the Unity Walk, and create volunteer service projects, and basically centering around interfaith dialogue throughout the year. Because I think that is very important, to simply first teach and inform about the different religions and where they are coming from, and and what kind of things they believe in. I don't know whether your book is mentioning the Unity Walk or not. I know that there's one new book out that mentions it. So it's maybe one of these beyond things, that may surface now. So I allow myself to distribute a couple of flyers after that.
I'll be mentioning it in my sermon this coming Sunday.
Oh, thank you.
I'll let you know. Before
Thank you very
I'm going
much.
to just stack a couple. We're at the time now, so before I'm going to give them each the last word here. But I'm going to stack a couple questions and then let Dinah and Gustav respond. I saw two hands here, and then maybe we'll take these last two questions and let our guests respond. And if there are further questions, folks might stick around depending on their schedules. So I saw a question here and then here.
Yes, my name is Mel Hardy, and I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for writing the book, and thank you for being a theologian who's not afraid to sort of speak in a group like this about God and Jesus and all of that. One of the, I think, successes of the civil rights movement was the interfaith connection. How do we get back to that model?
It's a great question.
Hi, I'm Gary Mitchell from the Mitchell Report, and I wanted to ask, in the course of the work that both of you have done in writing your books in particular, I'm curious to know, you've focused on the concept of interfaith and Muslims and Jews and Christians and Jews and Muslims. Did you see examples of where religious organizations, communities, etc., are spending any time seeking out the sort of atheist, agnostic point of view, not with the goal of proselytizing, but I've forgotten which one of you were talking about the experience of Christians not being in charge, but so the question really is, in addition to the interfaith stuff, have you seen examples of any sort of formal or informal dialogue taking place between the atheist, agnostic, and people of faith? And if so, what can you tell us, and what did you learn from that?
So you have three good questions, and I'd invite you either to respond to any of the above. Either one.
I'll quickly take the atheists.
For how many points?
The place where I've run into that most in relationship to the work and research that I do is in the Pacific Northwest, where there is a higher number of people who claim no version of theism. It's a much more European kind of worldview up in that part of the United States than there is in other parts of the United States. There is a group up there called Off the Map, where they are actually constructing conversations between people who are of theistic worldview and people who are non-theists. And then they have produced a video called Jim and Casper Go to Church. And Jim is a Christian minister and a former Assemblies of God person, and Casper is an atheist. And they together go to a bunch of churches and then have a discussion about everything that they saw. And they have been taking this video around to both bookstores, sort of secular communities in the Northwest, and having people talk about it. And they're also taking it to churches, even some rather conservative ones, and having people talk about it. So that's just one little example of one of these kinds of projects. So I have seen some of that going on.
I'll just add, it must be collaborative. I think some of the people who've been leading the atheist charge of late have been, they're more of the fundamentalist atheists that just scream at you, and that doesn't get anywhere. It just doesn't work. But to get the civil rights question, let's start with this. Quote, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." Martin Luther King. I think that King can simply be quoted. I mean, so much of where he was going, well, where he was all along, but also where he was going after sort of the major legislation was achieved, was really encouraging this deep thought about human commonality. Yes, I agree with you completely, and Taylor Branch, I think, does an admirable job in his histories of bringing out the interfaith character of some of the civil rights marches. But this is, King, I think, in himself remains a powerful figure within the interfaith movement. He's one of this sort of half dozen in this, and I mentioned them in here among people who tend to get cited over and over again. And I'm going to close my comments by telling you why I think this is so good. But it's King, it's Gandhi, it's the Dalai Lama, who's still among us, of course, Nelson Mandela, more of a secular figure, of course, Dorothy Day, and Pope John Paul II, who can, of course, be somewhat controversial for some. But in interfaith work, a stellar leading person, and also just in care of sort of the globalized consciousness. Now, the thing is, these people their names and their words come back and back and back. And what this leads me to think is that there will come a time when Osama bin Laden will not be well remembered. What happened won't be forgotten, but he himself will pass from the scene. But the memory of these other people will not, and their writings and their works and their inspiration will remain with us. And if you think about, I'll give you an example about this. That, what I quoted in there comes out of the letter from Birmingham jail. Who in the world could tell any one of us to whom that letter was ostensibly addressed? It was addressed to 8 white clergymen in Birmingham, Alabama. You got to Google the letter to find their names, and then, you know, you'd have to, I mean, it's the people who got in the way that we really don't remember now. They're famous for a brief time. It's the people who inspire us, who've been working for some sort of broader good. Their names remain with us.
That's a fitting and powerful way to conclude our time together. I thank you very much for being here. And please join me in thanking Dinah and Gustav for their comments and their witness, and for Gustav for his just remarkable book. Have a great day.